Hi, everyone. Whoa, sorry. Welcome to the last session of the Geometry of Redistricting conference. So after having heard a lot about theory, all sorts of theory, mathematical, computational, political, legal theory, we thought we'd give you a chance to hear from people who have actually been in the trenches and see how it's done in the real world. So our speakers at today's panel, which is called How the Lines Are Actually Drawn and Contested, our speakers have decades and decades between them of experience assisting legislatures and communities in redistricting. So they'll tell us a little bit about what actually happens. So our first speaker today is Bensen. He is a data analyst and attorney long active in politics at the local, state, and national levels. In 1974, he founded Polydata, a company that produces demographic and political guides and political data analysis. And just a reminder, any questions go to tinyurl.com/askjerry.
Okay.
Go ahead, Clark. Oh.
This is not for the slide, but I just prefer to stand. Can everyone hear me fine? No. I thought there was there we are. Oh, there's
Yeah.
an echo. Okay, well, I'm going to go over basically the kind of some of the practical aspects of drawing a plan, not like as if you were sitting there right now doing it and everything. But before you can draw a plan, of course, there are a couple of steps you need to think of ahead of time. For most cases, and this is more or less from the perspective of a state legislature or a big city council or something like that, but especially for state legislatures. First off, they have responsibilities in the general sense of drawing lines for both congressional districts and legislative districts, and of course generally two plans in most states for the legislature, the Senate and the House. So what they need to do is to start, and in fact many states have already started in the last couple of years, there's a lot of work that needs to be done during the preceding decade. And the number one thing that's I guess the mnemonic here is D for data. There are several elements of data that you have to develop ahead of time. There are several elements of data that you have to develop in conjunction with the Census Bureau. And regardless, you're going to have to work this out. Some of the data that you need ahead of time is if in fact you're going to use political data, which is still today at least 90% of entities are using the political data. Even those who don't want to have a political bias, they have to have the election results. The trick with the election results is not just getting a precinct file and saying, like you would for targeting, but you have to be able to match it up to the census geography. And the trick on doing that is to have the census blocks and the precincts, and in the old days you would actually overlay them and match them up. Now it's a little easier in a sense. And you have to have that ahead of time. And of course, precincts, depending on the state, change frequently. In a lot of times, a lot of counties, first off, it's almost all county-based or town-based in New England. The precincts will change for each election, which could be a primary election. So you have to start working on that, and that's at least one thing you can do throughout the decade that is more or less manageable. The other thing you have to do is work with the geography aspect, which is part of the Census Bureau aspect. Census Bureau has, and if you've heard phase one, phase two, isn't that wonderful? But the point is, phase one is to actually help draw the block boundaries. Phase two is to actually draw the precinct boundaries. These are both optional programs with the Census Bureau. But if you don't participate in the first one, it's not critical. You just get the blocks that they had last time from the 2010 census. If you don't participate in the VTD part, that means you're not going to have a readily available set of matching the precincts to the blocks. But even if you do, that's only part of the problem because you have to still do the 2012, 2014, 2016 elections and match them to precincts because the VTDs you use in 2020 are only good for, in most states, 2018 and 2020 because they're frozen in time. The other aspect you've got to work on is things you can monitor throughout the decade. Population estimates, which come out every year, are a very high-level number. They come down to counties, they come down to towns in most places, but not every town because it's a sample, and some of it's administrative records. But the ACS, which is what used to be the long form, it has all the demographic data. And this is useful to monitor throughout the decade from the standpoint of just what the trends are. The first trend you need to focus on is where are the people moving into or out of? Because in a lot of cases you will have a full, like in a legislative seat especially, it's not so much congressional, you will have a whole seat or two just evaporate from a certain region. So those three things, of course, require resources, and they require resources at the beginning of the decade as well as at the closer you get to the census. First thing, and again, this is from a legislative standpoint, but you've got to have an office somewhere. You've got to have some place that, in fact, you can secure all your equipment and your software and your data and all that kind of stuff, and hopefully a place that's quiet and off the beaten path. So it doesn't get, you don't have people dropping in all the time, because that, trust me, there's a lot of work to do. Equipment-wise and such is, you don't really need supercomputers. I mean, you can pretty much, I don't want to say any laptop. Any laptop can run specialized software, but you don't want to do the heavy-duty work on a normal laptop. But you get a workstation, which is, you know, not a lot of money. The trick is to get two big screens, not necessarily this large, but if you had, like, you know, two 30-inch TV screens, as it were, you'd have one which would have your map and one which would have your data. And as you're going through, you've got all sorts of things to keep track of. The first thing you got to work on, and Jeff will go over this a little bit too, but you can't, before you draw any map at all, even your first district, there are certain things you have to figure out. The first one is, what's your population deviation? Now, criteria, by criteria I mean, in some states they're actually written down. The legislature may adopt them. Some of them may be in the Constitution. The legislature will draft a resolution, you know, putting them down and hopefully putting them down in some sort of order of precedence. And population deviation is always one of these that actually matters in how you draw the map. Generally speaking, for legislatures, the range would be plus or minus 1 or plus or minus 2%, whereas even 10 years ago it was plus or minus 5. You need to know that right away, because you can't even start your first district until you know what you're aiming for. And then this is why the second screen with all the numbers comes in handy, because you have to do little things like keep track of what your actual deviation is as you're going along. So you can say, oh, I was 500 over here, so now I'm 400 over here, and, you know, and that kind of stuff. Plus, you have to keep track of the very simple things. If you want to do, let's say, three categories of political data, you have Republican districts, Democrat districts, and something in the middle. You can refine that even more. It's really very good to basically, as if you're doing it on a yellow pad, just have it on the screen, because the worst thing is to spend days and days and days doing a full plan to find out you're one district over or below. And it's actually very easy to do. So you have to keep track of things like that. The criteria are, from a practical standpoint, there are quite a few that really sort of make sense. And some that are pretty arcane. Contiguity, you know, district has to have, everything has to be together. Well, that sounds pretty basic, but in some states, especially in the Midwest, you have municipalities that have discontiguous parts. So you want to say, like, Columbus is a perfect example, although it's huge, but a lot of larger municipalities are like that. You just say, I want to put all of this, you know, Adams Township in, or more likely Adams City, into this district. Well, all of a sudden it's not contiguous. So it is a little trickier than you think on that. Compactness, I understand, has been discussed a little bit, so I'll go into that a little bit too, which is, compactness has several different meanings. And from a line drawer's perspective, it does not have the meaning you probably think it does. Even if one of the high-level criteria is compactness, it is generally speaking not a numerical perspective on what the compactness is from the standpoint of people actually drawing the plans. Again, they're drawing on the screen, and again, most of them do not have a 30-inch screen. Most of them have a normal, like, 17-inch computer monitor. There's only so much they're going to look at the time. So to them, compactness means one of two things generally. It means kind of like, what does it sort of look like when you step back and look at the actual outline? And the other is, it's more of a functional compactness, which is it may be a very long bacon strip kind of thing because it's going up and down Route 2 or something. So from a line drawer's perspective, they don't really give that much focus because, again, they're so into one district at a time. Now, analysts will look at it, analysts and observers. Observers who have not been part of the process may just look at it once you, in fact, print out a statewide map and say, what's wrong with that district? The one that's all squiggly. So it does raise its ugly head, as it were, every so often because, excuse me, the whole point of having a district that looks odd is probably something's going on there. What's going on? Doesn't mean it's nefarious, but the point is it draws your attention. So you have to do that. The other aspect of compactness from the standpoint of how you draw the plans is you don't do it until the end of the plan. So since many plans are not drawn one at a time, but are collaborations of regional maps done at different times and then stitched together, one of the last things that the line drawer looks at is actually compactness from, REOC pulse and popper and such like that. Another criteria that's really critical is really the community of interest, and that can mean almost anything, but basically we usually think of that as being political subdivisions or like neighborhoods or something like that. The only other thing I think, because my time is pretty much up, is the oh yes, my leader story, I forgot. You can't think that a district per se is really going to be what you would want it to be. And the story was I had a leader of a legislature, it was the House, and his district, when it came out with the new numbers for the new census, was exactly the ideal population for that new census. So one would think that his district would in fact be sacrosanct. No, it was blown asunder. So you can't just think that if it looks like a good district and it doesn't have much population, it's going to survive. It probably won't.
Thank you. I should say, by the way, for context, that Clark is a consultant for Republican legislatures mostly. Jeff is a consultant for Democrats mostly, and Kareem is a consultant for neither. Or different, many different, not yes. So that we have a wide variety of perspectives here. So our next speaker is Jeff Wice. He is of counsel to Randler, Reif, Lamb, Rosenstein, and Birkenstock, and has worked for legislatures and localities across the nation, including New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, California, and Virginia. He is staff chair of the National Conference of State Legislatures Elections and Redistricting Committee, and is the Jackal Fellow at SUNY Buffalo Law School, where he directs a redistricting and election law program. You can sit if you want. Or you can... Oh, well.
Well, it's a pleasure being here tonight, and I want to give you some of the practical do's and don'ts of being an expert or working on redistricting itself. Let me ask a question to start. How many of you today use a telephone to contact somebody instead of an email or a text message? Who uses the telephone first? Before you contact somebody, do you use the telephone or do you text or email? Who uses the phone as the initial contact? Okay, well, learn to use the telephone. It's going to be your new best friend if you are going to get involved in redistricting. In 2001, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case out of North Carolina called Easley versus Cromartie. And part of the decision focused on an email that was sent to the chairman of the redistricting committee by a staff member at 2:30 in the morning. In the decision where the Supreme Court essentially held that after the Shaw v. Reno case, if you learn that from 1994, North Carolina was in court for the entire decade and passed the 2000 census taking into 2001 when the Supreme Court finally said, enough already, no more racial gerrymandering. This plan could be acceptable because it was a partisan gerrymander, which at that point was still legal. But North Carolina had 3 or 4 iterations of plans. It was before the Supreme Court, I think, 4 times. But in the final decision, Justice Stephen Breyer said, I'll read from the decision, that Senator Cooper's statement and Cohen's email and some aspects of Dr. Weber's testimony taken together does not show that racial considerations predominated the boundaries drawing. Email doesn't mean that much. Justice Thomas, in a dissent, said that I am convinced that the district court permissibly could have accorded great weight to this email. So that they were debating an email. Well, in preparing for tonight's talk, I contacted the email staffer, Jerry Cohen, since retired, and he told me, it's funny, this was back in 1992. He saved that email. It was sent at 2:30 in the morning, and Senator Cooper, who's now the governor, never read emails. So you have 2 Supreme Court justices fighting over an email where the recipient never even saw it, but it became part of the record. And that's kind of the point that I'm making, that to quote Martin Lemazny, a turn-of-the-last-century Boston politician, he said, never write if you can speak, never speak if you can nod, never nod if you can wink. And that was appended by a former New York governor who got himself in hot water, Eliot Spitzer, by saying, and never put it in an email, which he did, and if you know the New York story, he had to resign as governor. So essentially, you're going to be entering an area where you need to be very, very careful and work very closely with your lawyers, because everything you say, that you do, that you write, that you talk, will likely end up in court and help make or break a plan, a challenge, or a defense. You've all been discussing, hearing about the Gill versus Whitford case. And in 2010, the Republican leadership in Wisconsin, hoping to just ram a partisan gerrymander through, contracted out the entire process to a law firm, hoping that whatever the law firm did, drawing a plan, hiring consultants, holding hearings, everything that most legislatures do themselves could be protected from discovery by using a law firm. And as things progressed before the Gill case was brought, in 2011, the Democrats won control of the Wisconsin Senate for about 5-6 months. But that period enabled Senator Mike Miller, a Democrat who became the majority leader, to take a look at the contract that the previous majority leader, the Republican, had signed with the law firm. And it said that information will only be available to the majority leader at his or her direction. And the Democrat figured, okay, I want to see what you guys did from 2010, 2011, 2012. And by virtue of the contract, the judge said, yes, you must turn over the information to the Senate Democrats. The Senate Democrats lost the control a few months later. It was a quirk of a special election recall, and the Republicans took over again. But the information that was obtained from the law firm, created the basis for what is now the case going before the Supreme Court in October. So how you put things together, what's said, and emails. The biggest thing you face in preparing for both the legislative process and the litigation process are emails. The worst pain that lawyers and their staffs and experts go through is the discovery process, where tons, literally tons and boxes of emails are requested. The courts say there's no legislative privilege to legislators in redistricting anymore. Turn it over, and you go through boxes and just pages of this material, but that's where the smoking guns are discovered. So the more you put in an email, the more you put in a discoverable text, the more that could be used against you. You need to plan that nothing will ever get done on time, that nothing that you do is going to be perfect. You've got to learn how to use your software over and over. You need to know who your clients are. You need to understand what is their objective. You need to understand your place as an expert or a technician is to be very objective and rely on your skills, your knowledge, not your personal animosities or thoughts. You're doing a job for the client. Obviously, you'll be hired by the client because you identify with them, but you have to know what their objectives are. You have to know at the front end of the process, if you're going in as an expert before the lines are drawn, what the criteria are. You need to learn the map, the last map, the communities, the demographic changes. You need to walk through the entire process over and over until you're comfortable with it. You need to understand the software. Things break down. You need to make sure that your computer is in a safe place. You never want to leave your computer on overnight. You never want to leave a laptop open. You never want to work in an office where a visitor can come in and see what you're doing. You always want to save your work every time you leave the computer and know plan A from plan F to plan Z, so it's easily findable and cataloged. One thing, those of you who are mathematicians, the biggest, simplest, dumbest mistake I ever saw was in Connecticut in 1991, where the Democrats and Republicans got together to divide up drawing the House of Representatives in a bipartisan way. The Democrats controlled, and it was essentially a plan to retain incumbency of both parties as best they could. Connecticut had a deadline of September 15th by which they had to have a plan done, or it went to a commission and then to the courts. At about 9 o'clock that evening in September, I left Hartford to go to my in-laws' home in Northampton, Massachusetts, and got a call at 11:55 p.m. from the Democratic leader, don't come back tomorrow, because the Republicans walked in smiling and said, here are our districts, but they drew one too many districts that they were allotted. When you have, let's say, 110 districts in a chamber, and you're asked to draw 40, you can't come in with 41. You just can't take one district off, throw it away. It all has to work together. So you be very careful, check, go back over and over again. Redistricting, can be an enjoyable experience, but there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent allies, there are only temporary accommodations. And it's a process where you have to be very, very fact-driven, very objective, and to be very careful in what you do, because what you say will be used against you. I'm sure you'll be trained on becoming a witness, how to be cross-examined. You never want to tell someone something they don't need to know. You want to answer questions very simply and to the point. When you work with state legislators or local government officials, or even challenges to a plan, don't trust anybody at the front end, because they all want to be your friend, for good or for bad. You have to feel your own way through the process and be very careful. Now, I'm entering my 5th decade of redistricting. Clark has done this for just as many years. Somehow we both survived and want to do it again. So either we're crazy, or this is something that we're really excited that you all want to be part of. But this is also a zero-sum game. It is a political game. You'll hear about nonpartisan redistricting, about commissions versus legislatures. I'm a Democrat. Clark is a Republican. In the end, he might say he wants Paul Ryan as Speaker. I might want Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. That's what it gets down to. There are good and bad points of both commissions and legislatures. But if you do the job objectively, fairly, and transparently, and you know what you're doing, and you're careful every minute, you're able to survive this process. I think I've used up my 15 minutes, and we'll even this out till 8:30. So thank you all very much.
All right, and okay. So our final speaker on this panel is Kareem Crayton. He's a JD PhD scholar, expert, and consultant who specializes in election policy and law, along with redistricting. He was a key advisor for the Redistricting Game, an online educational tool on redistricting. He's currently a visiting professor at Vanderbilt University Law School and managing partner of Crimcard Consulting Services, a firm that aids groups around the globe seeking greater political efficacy and equality.
Good evening. I want to say what I should have said at my earlier talk, but let me express a great deal of thanks to the organizers of this event, in particular Moon, for inviting me, but also for conceiving this idea. I think it has been attempted in theory and a couple of other iterations, but I don't think it has ever been done in such a sort of concerted and comprehensive manner. So I'm really appreciative and excited, both for the sort of development of the concept, but also to see where it goes from here. And in particular, for this panel, I'm excited to be a part of a conversation about the practicalities of redistricting. I'm not going to talk as long, in part because I don't have as many cycles of redistricting behind me as I was just hearing. The date on which Clark founded Politodata, which I was aware of for any number of years, was the year I was born. So I don't know that I have as much experience as either of them, and I mean that in the most admirable way. They really do have a ton to share, and frankly, I come at it from a different perspective as well. I started in the professorate and really had a lot of interest in applying a lot of the work that I do, both in writing and in teaching, to the work that we, I think, really sorely need in the public. And so I think I mentioned in my prior talk, I've been involved with suits against Democrats and suits against Republicans. And my view has always been that, at least my personal commitments, I told the group earlier that I spoke to, the commitments have always been about having more public engagement, and that more of the results of redistricting ought to be driven by what the public wants. I get the fight between Democrats and Republicans, and I'm appreciative of the role that both of them play in the matter, but I find important now that, partly due to the sort of presence of greater technology and more people who do what you all do, that more people, more of us citizens, should be actively involved in this. In the 60s and the 70s, when we even got into the conversation about drawing districts more regularly, there weren't that many people out there who could do this stuff. So you could count the number of people in a state on your hand who could sit down in a room and actually do the stuff, and who actually did do it. And now we have the ability in the 2010s and certainly onward for the ability of more people who have expertise and new ideas to be involved. And so my goal in this is to talk a little bit about the ways in which I think we can make that happen. I really just have 3 points, and then I really want to engage in an exchange with the room. And it really responds in some ways to some of the thoughts that have been raised earlier. Serving as a consultant is a really important responsibility, and no matter whether it is a process in which the legislature is doing the line drawing or an independent commission is doing the line drawing, you are valued for your expertise, and everybody in this room has some of some variety, but you're also valued for your judgment. And I think both of those are really crucial to understand how to convey to people who have their own wants and desires, but also people who might have their own anxieties about a process that they don't really have a lot of familiarity with, who have a great deal sometimes of skepticism about, right? Because you're asking, in many cases, for people to engage with a system that has always been a closed party, where they're on the outside looking in, and a group of people for whom sometimes the idea of political efficacy, a word I use a lot, a phrase I use a lot, is a foreign concept. They're not used to things ever working out for a variety of reasons. They don't have the resources to make this stuff happen. The system has, historically not done things that have been helpful to them. So part of your role is going to be, I think, convincing them that there is worthwhile effort to be put into engaging in the process. Part of that is structure, but part of that is actually the relationship you have with them. And so for those of you all who engage in line drawing, for example, it was rightly mentioned earlier, much of what you're going to do is to tell people in a way that any counselor might what is and is not possible. But part of what this requires of you as well is, when the lines aren't very clear between what black and white is, there's a lot of gray, to import your best advice to people. But at the same time recognizing that, at least in my opinion, The choice is ultimately the people who are going to be represented, the people who actually have to vote and be represented in the districts that are drawn. And how you actually develop the difference between what you think is clearly mandated, what can and cannot be defended, versus the kind of space where, it could go left or it could go right. And each one of those comes with its upsides and its challenges. Those are the places where I think you do your best work. And it requires a lot of nuance and sensitivity and respect for the communities that you're trying to serve. And so what I would say, regardless of party in this conversation, is before you engage in a relationship with any of these groups that you're trying to represent, and I really hope many of you all offer your services to a broad set of groups, whether it's at the local level or something closer to the federal level, that you take time to hear what people's wants and desires are, what their fears are, because a lot of that will help you tailor the kinds of advice that you offer them. Now, again, I know, I've been an academic for a while as well. Our job is to be smart, right? To show that we understand the sophistication and the nuance and the exception to every rule, and all of that's important to know. But at some point, as a judge I worked for once told me, people need an answer. And your job sometimes is to give them an answer. And sometimes, just to be clear, the answer is there is no answer. And the thing that you have to help them work through is, to the extent that you, the client, have to answer this question, these are the kinds of challenges that you have to think through and navigate. Now, we do this a lot in law school. I talk to, people who are going to be lawyers a lot in this, but it turns out that as people who have expertise, sometimes the answers stop at a certain level, and at that point beyond, you have to walk people through the process of figuring out, well, okay, you're charting your own course from here. The courts haven't given you an answer. The legislature doesn't know what the research shows. So you've got to make the best argument you can based upon, that is, you, the client, have to make the best argument you can based on the best information that you have available. To me, that is where, if you're serving the public, and I mean public broadly defined, you do your best work. It's a challenge, it's not simple, but as I say, it's easier to serve people who do this a lot, right? The electeds understand what their interests are. There are fights to be had, as I'm sure you've heard already. You'll hear some more soon, and I can tell you plenty of those stories. But the people who haven't been represented, the people who are going to be new to this game, those are the people who really need your help. And I really want to encourage everybody in this room to think about places where there's a nonprofit group, a community organization who's never been involved in redistricting. That's where you can be of the greatest service. And I really would be excited to see, even if it's half of you all in this room, to spend some time working with people, because it helps them make a cleaner, more sophisticated, and hopefully more effective argument to the people who are ultimately making decisions. So with that, I want to thank you for the time. I look forward to the exchange for going forward. Thank you.
Okay, so once again, a reminder, we're taking questions at Ask Jerry. My first question for the speakers is, there seems to be a bunch of questions coming from the audience on the topic of something like, couldn't we envision a transparent process that works just as well as the secretive one you're describing? Do you think the degree of secrecy in this process actually serves the public?
I don't think secrecy works to anyone's advantage. I developed a strategy, a practice years back, where working for a majority Democratic caucus in the legislature, not only did we go through a public hearing process and move around the state and take in a lot of comment, but we developed the plan. There were 99 districts, and we had about 60 Democrats at that point, but every district was developed based on objective criteria that had to be adhered to, and that when it came time to enact the plan in court, in the legislature, I had the chair of the committee stand up in the chamber and walk through each of the districts, 1 through 99, and explain why and how each one met the criteria. That explained to the public the constitutionality of it, and also anticipating a challenge, which did happen, the defense that this was a plan that was constitutional, that was legal, that was vetted through a fair process. here in Massachusetts, if you look at the most recent redistricting, the legislature drew in a very dark blue state a plan that civil rights groups, Republicans, everyone said went through the best website probably in the country, hearing process, criteria, empowered both political parties, minority parties, additional minority districts, and was a model that we worked very hard on to develop.
I think the trick here is really depends on the state.
I don't think the mic is on.
Are you
Oh,
on?
am I supposed to?
There's a-
No?
Oh, I think you're
On top, there's a switch.
I think.
Oh, how so simple. I think really it depends on the state. In a lot of states, and I don't want to say it tends to be smaller states, but in a lot of states, this is really not that much of a contentious process. There really is cooperation between the parties in the chamber, and they have public hearings to get input. They go through the whole process. I frankly have never been in a situation, as Jeff has described, where they went through every district. But they will usually, and this goes back to what I said about drawing regional maps sometimes, they will break it up so that they'll have different members, whatever party is in the majority. They'll have a couple, like 2 majority members and 1 minority member go out and do the Northeast region. And they'll have probably a couple of different options for maps, and they'll get the input from that. The problem, I think, is really more so from the standpoint of, and Wisconsin, and this was, I believe, one of the problems at the lower court, the optics were bad. So it doesn't help to do a plan like that, no matter, and this is not just the trying to keep it all within the law firm thing. So the problem, I think, there is that's, again, depends on the state, but more importantly, it's not really just the state as much as how let's say it's Republicans this time, how the Republicans were treated last census. If the Democrats controlled the process last time and they shut the Republicans out entirely, then I'm thinking the odds are that Republicans are going to shut the Democrats out. So that's part of the problem, and that's why you have to, from the outset, to the extent you can, work with the other side. And several states have done that. Again, it really just depends on the state and the people involved. If a member who's in charge of the bill really wants to just basically say, this is a good chance for us to work with everybody in the legislature, let's just go and find out what they want, and especially even not in a one-party state, but a party that's already in the majority, there's no real downside to them. Maybe they lose a couple of seats because they give something to the other side, but it's a lot easier to get the bill through and have everybody happy about it, which does not happen very often, I'll have to admit. But
So I want to get into, I guess, the work of legislatures and the sort of D's versus R's story. As I said, I have a few of those examples. And I guess the thing I would say about transparency, or whether or not, pretty early on whether or not you're in a process that ought to be taken seriously, for transparency, for example. And you know it for a number of reasons. One, because the people who are running in the districts that are going to be drawn are keenly aware of it. But two, you kind of know it, and actually I like the comment about the person who's in charge. The person who's appointed will give you a very good clue. Because if it's a person who's understood to be credible, and who has a history of working on both sides of the aisle, you kind of know you're going to get at least a fair shot at making your claim. Not saying it's going to be an outcome that works well, but in most cases, at least certainly in this cycle, that was not the case for most of the cases I've worked with. And they knew from day one that the people who have been appointed, I'm thinking now of one person who, was pretty decent in terms of avoiding saying any of the things that would have gotten them in trouble. Unfortunately, and this gets to Jeff's point, aside from watching email, you should also watch, when you're working in a public space, the intercom. Turns out that there was one person who said in what he thought was going to be a private conference with his fellow party members, where somebody introduced him as, well, this is our chief obfuscator. And this made the news, and you could tell, every potential plaintiff was like, I'm going to cut and paste that and put it right in my brief. And so it's that sort of thing that, sends a message out, not just to potential plaintiffs, but also to members. And in that vein, it's always crucial, and I guess this is the other point I wanted to make about this, from the perspective of the party that knows it's about to get hosed, right? They're under the gun, they know the chances are that they're going to have to go and file a lawsuit. There's always going to be an effort to pick off one or two people, to give them a district that looks more or less like what they want, and to use them as a sort of presentation of, well, this was bipartisan, we got their vote, and we responded to their concerns. So this wasn't about party, or it wasn't about some prohibited interest. And the task of the minority party in that instance is always make sure everybody stays on the boat. Notwithstanding what might look like a deal that might benefit you individually, it's going to be really bad, and you may not get the thing that you hoped you would obtain. And usually, and this goes back to Jeff's point, your words that you offer in support of that little deal that you think you're going to cut for yourself, those are going to be repeated back to you several times, intentionally or not, in the worst possible way. And so it's the kind of thing that transparency would work against, right? There are no conversations behind closed doors and backroom deals that later shock the other side when the lawsuit happens. So having things out in the open makes a lot of sense, I think.
One additional quick point that you remind me of, when I mentioned naming, keeping track of your plans that you keep in your computer, never give them funny names.
Yeah.
Because in New York in 2002, one technician called a plan that was put out there for the purpose of failing. They wanted to scare the people by putting out the first plan, knowing that they'll fix a lot of things in the second plan, but to identify the intermediate plan, they called it Brooklyn Mayhem. And that came out in discovery and just showed there was no honest intent. And that goes to the transparency of it. Don't play games. This is serious.
So question for each of you in turn. So in your experience, what kinds of instructions do you get, or does the person or company that does the line drawing get from either a partisan group or, in Kareem's case, maybe a community group? Like, what kinds of goals are they telling you to achieve? What kinds of goals are you then trying to achieve? Is there a difference between the explicit instructions they give and the implicit agenda there?
I was once told by a state senate president, I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer. When I'm a lawyer, I do what my client wants me to do, not what I think they should do. And when you're my lawyer, you do what I tell you to do. Well, my set of rules come down from the United States Constitution, from the state constitution, the state or locality laws. I've got to follow those. Both as a member of the bar and as someone who puts himself out as hopefully an honest lawyer, I've got to follow the rules that I've got. And you've got to be aware of what the laws are, but then within that, secondarily, as I mentioned in my remarks, what is your client's interest? What do they want? And to keep yourself out of the personal, the subjective part of it. But the rules, the laws, the court precedents pretty much tell you what you want to do, what you have to do.
Well, most line drawers are unencumbered by the Code of Professional Responsibility, so they don't have to worry about that. But I think an apt statement is something that I use sometimes with campaign types, which is it's not really my responsibility to determine when you're lying or not, but I think you ought to know when you are lying. And that's part of the problem when you get directions from the leader or whomever. They say they should do this and this and this, and we would say there might be a problem with that, but a normal line drawer probably would not know, and that's in fact how some of the problems come about, especially in a plan that has 150 seats or something like that. There's always going to be a few districts that somebody skips over, and there could be some bad stuff in some of those districts. But in general, you will have one person who's not necessarily the bill sponsor, but someone who's really the person in charge of it and giving directions. But as I said, a lot of times they'll have regional plans too. So the person who's actually drawing the map may be doing purely ministerial tasks, and the actual decisions were made by the other members of the legislature or whomever who are doing the regional maps.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad that point came up, because I think the key thing to understanding how this best works is to understand your role, or to put it differently, stay in your lane. And sometimes your lane is offering actual advice and guidance, and sometimes it is the ministerial work of doing the actual line drawing that the person is directing you to do. And again, depending on the expertise that's represented in the room, you might be doing one or maybe both of those things. The one thing I would say, and I've seen versions of this where a group or an entity knows generally what it wants to see, but doesn't quite know how that works out in a map. So it may be regional, it may be sort of a concept where reflects a particular group that happens to sit throughout the entire state. Sometimes though, the conversation turns out to be a straight up fight, and it's a knife fight between two people who can't have the same thing, right? There's probably, I don't know if it's easy or hard actually, I'm curious to know what other people think about this, when you're basically the group that's under the gun versus the group that has the majority votes. But it happens on both sides of that street. I'll say that the easier case, in my experience, has always been, it's been like 2 iterations that I've done this thing, but for my experience, it has been fairly easy to resolve fights between people on the minority side of things, because most of the time you're drawing districts not that are ever going to be adopted, but that you're drawing districts for the purpose of showing a court that your plan shows a fault in the plan that's ultimately voted out of the legislature. And so the answer you can give to both groups is, both sides of this fight is, look, I don't know whether it's your side or your side that has the better argument in the real world, but for the purposes of this legal exercise, we need to make sure that we have a map that's defensible. And so this is not a map that ever is likely to be one that you run in. But I need you to understand that for our purposes, the object of this enterprise is not to award, county A or plot A or community A to you or you. It's to get this thing past the next level. But more than anything, I guess the point in all of this is to suggest the role in these sorts of fights, I think, is always to be an honest broker, to be upfront about what the principle is, and to be upfront with each of them, whoever the warring parties are, about why you came to the decision that you came to. And somebody's going to walk away unhappy, but the point is that they respect your judgment.
Kareem, I wanted to ask you a quick question, which is, I think we have a pretty good sense of the clients that Clark and Jeff work for, the sort of the legislatures, but you mentioned other groups. I just wanted to hear a couple of examples of groups that you worked for which were not legislatures.
Sure. So in the local context, you typically don't have a lot of the same D's versus R's fights. And in fact, it turns out some of the ugliest fights can be where there are no D's and R's. It turns out to be purely personal. So say for a city council redistricting, you get people who have been there for a long time, who may have grudges against other people, or who may decide that they just feel like they want new parts of the town. I will just talk generally about one case, the city of Los Angeles. I actually lived in Los Angeles for a long period of time, about 5 years. Downtown, which at the time I moved there was not particularly populated, but if any of you all have visited there in the last few years, it's now like the place to be. And exemplified by the new places where if you clothe your dog in outfits now, there are like not just one but several places where you can purchase apparel, right? You're a place on the map when you have many of those spots. So with that, of course, comes money, potential political donors, and a fight over who gets to have those people as their constituents. And you have an interesting dynamic. Traditionally, downtown had been merged with geographically southern areas of the city that had been economically more depressed, and the places downtown and slightly north of downtown had been a little bit more economically well off. So I've worked with coalitions of groups that have been community organizations that thought that that was actually a good thing, that the more affluent parts of that district would be helpful for some of the work that was necessary in the more southern and more economically depressed areas. And as that changed, there were new groups that said, wait a minute, I'm not sure that we bought into that idea. We, like an idea of an affluent district, and we don't necessarily want the less affluent areas than before. And so part of it involved a challenge where you've got to navigate whether one version of that makes more sense than the other. Another example, actually, also out of California, was at the state legislative level. there were organizations in the state that had been really well organized. This was the first time California had drawn all of its districts, state legislative and congressional, using an independent commission. What that meant was that the typical organizational groups that were highly political couldn't be involved. And so what it left was large community organizations and also ethnic organizations that had established legal entities within them. They were basically the groups that were pushing most of the maps that had been drawn. Well, that was easy to do for Asian Americans who were sufficiently large in Southern California and Latinos who were large all over the state because they had existing organizations there. African Americans had not. They had been actually a group that had been shrinking in population, and they didn't have the kind of institutional apparatus. The Legal Defense Fund, which was about as close as you were going to get, had left the West Coast, and so there was no natural alliance that was already institutionally there for them, and so I assisted them. And so what emerged, just to complete the point, was essentially an ad hoc group to help devise districts that African Americans thought would fairly represent them in different parts of the state, but that had to sit, and this goes back to the regional point, in a map that would be fairly representative of other groups as well. And that was the result, ultimately, of a negotiation between these different organizations. Not an easy thing to do, particularly in places like LA, where all of these groups sort of have significant populations, some of which are right on top of each other. But that's the kind of work that sometimes can be just as sort of sensitive as some of the stuff that goes on between Democrats and Republicans.
Thanks. So, Jeff, you mentioned that there are pros and cons to legislatures versus independent commissions drawing the maps. So I'd like to hear from all of you, what are the pros and cons of the various kinds of parties that could carry out the redistricting, legislatures or independent commissions or special masters or judges or what have you?
Try that first.
Well, it's good you added that tagline. There are actually all sorts of ways to do it. Of course, special masters are generally speaking only once you're in court, hence the term. But that brings up another avenue of, or another aspect of the redistricting, which is a lot of cases, well, I shouldn't say a lot, each decade, again, of the congressional and legislative plans, there are probably no more than a dozen that go to court in what we call impasse situations. And an impasse situation is basically, a typical example would be the governor is one party and both chambers of the legislature are the other party, or any combination thereof. And so there's actually no plan that has been adopted. In that case, someone will go to court and say, you know, hey, the current districts are unconstitutional because the population is out of whack, and therefore we need to have a plan, and the deadline is coming up, and filing deadline is 3 months away and we don't have a plan, so they go to court and then they fight about plans. Now there are two outcomes there. Either the judge will pick a plan or he or they will appoint a special master. Another footnote too is if you're in state court, it is usually one judge. If you are in federal court, in almost every case, it is a 3-judge federal panel that deals with it. That has its own set of good and bad. But if, in fact, the court appoints a special master, then the special master is pretty much on their own with some oversight from the judge, and there may be a consultant as well as the master. In other words, maybe a technical person who does the actual ministerial aspect, and the master is the one who deals with the judge and looks at the ramifications. Commissions can be problematic, and I think this is just from my experience, and of course I have a bias, which is I think if you're going to have a commission, it really has to have a bipartisan perspective so you can kind of force some sort of agreement somewhere. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work, even if you have that situation set up. If you have an independent commission, well, then it's got another problem because the question is it bipartisan with independence as well? So there's all sorts of problems there. It's not that commissions can't do good plans, it's just that, and again, this is just my internal bias from years of politics, is there's no one who knows the state better than members or candidates for the legislature in most districts. because they actually have their feet on the ground. And the same thing with the city council, probably more so in a city council or something like that, where they actually walk the district. Maybe not in LA, but in a medium-sized area. So it can be problematic either way. I just think that overall the partisan thing has not been as bad as most people think, even though there have certainly been some bad examples.
I'll try to be quick with it. I might have mentioned this in my remarks, but a legislature can responsibly redistrict if it follows rules, is transparent, is objective, and does a job the way a commission might do it. A legislature does a bad job if it's abusive, if it overly gerrymanders, and even if there's no court standard, even if the Gill case doesn't succeed, if a legislature shows it can't be trusted over a period of time, then a commission might be warranted. And at that point, I'll be very careful to differentiate. An independent commission must have no role for a legislature to review, accept, or modify a plan. All other commissions are usually advisory commissions. They result in the legislature approving or changing the plan, and the word independent is often misused. Independent means no role for any approval except through a court challenge at the end.
The only thing I'll add to all of this is I was skeptical about the concept of an independent commission, I'll confess. And I think that there are some challenges. I think I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of agnostic on the approach that you use. I told you my principles and my commitments. One of the things that I will say about independent commissions is the key to their working well is, particularly for independent citizens commissions like the one in California, there sometimes has to be a lot of coaching up. They aren't repeat players like elected officials are, so they are new to the game, but they're not without their own levels of expertise. We actually had, as I recall, on the California Commission, a mathematician. So these aren't people who haven't thought about some versions of this concept. The question is how to bring them along to understand the particular niceties of what it means to draw districts in this particular jurisdiction, wherever that is. And that's the job, and this takes me back to the point I've been sort of sermonizing on for all day. It really depends on the public. And if we actually expect districts to serve us, we have to do the work to make sure that the lines that are drawn reflects what we want. And we, I mean the citizenry, have a role to play in that, but we, people like us in this room who serve these groups when they say that they want to be involved, have a role to play in sort of helping them articulate that message. So it's not impossible. It does mean that there's more work that has to be done on the part of citizens, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. In a world where we think that in a presidential election, roughly half of the qualified registered electorate votes is a decent thing, we know we can do better. And it seems to me that that's one way in which we can encourage it.
Of all the people you have contact with in the redistricting process, so firms, clients, line drawers, judges, legislators, how diverse is that group? Are there people of color and or women in these conversations? Kareem is laughing.
Well, largely it depends on the state. I mean, I'd say there definitely is a more than equal share of women, shall we say, in the thing. Now, women are in most states are very active in this because a lot of them are in legislative staff positions, and a lot of them are chiefs of staff for people. So that's not really a factor I ever really thought about. Diversity, I mean, it really just depends on the state. Again, in most cases where the legislature is involved, most of the resources come from legislative staff. So.
I mean, I've worked for literally all kinds of people, races, ethnicities, sex, but what's important is that when lines are redrawn, that representative coalitions are aware that women's groups be aware of women candidates, and to make sure that although districts are based on geography, incumbency does matter. And there's often criticism of partisan gerrymandering or not protecting incumbents or trying to create more competition. But when you look back historically at how few African American and Hispanic and Asian American candidates were elected 30, 20 years ago, and the great number of women elected officials in the last 10, 20 years, their districts aren't guaranteed, except Voting Rights Act districts, so you want to be sure that there are lobbying efforts to keep different kinds of people who were elected in office there in the future.
So I guess you did catch me giggling a bit because this it could be a book in its way. So I think what has been said is absolutely right. There's been greater diversity in terms of the elected officials that, obviously have stakes in the game, and that's to the good of our democratic system. What I thought you might be asking, and maybe this is, or maybe I'm just importing, you can put me on the couch on this, maybe this is my own stuff coming out, but with respect to the people giving advice to the people who are elected, there's a different shift. So, often in a room where people are making decisions about, okay, is there a suit that's going to come from this? What does the nature of the claim look like? Yeah, I can't say that I see many faces that look like mine or are women or who don't fit the sort of white male standard that politics has, for a very long time sort of been driven by. Now, that doesn't mean that the people, I mentioned this point earlier, that the people who've been in the room haven't served a large number of interests, but it does mean something. And I think I want to make this point with respect to the issue I mentioned earlier about the groups that have a voice in how those decisions get made. So, legislatures are normally organized by having caucuses of different types, and there's usually a legislative black caucus. There can be sometimes a women's caucus, and usually in the sort of talk about how legislatures get stuff done, they're organized as groups. Well, let's just emphasize what that can sometimes leave out, right? That can sometimes leave out spaces where the democratic interest reflects all of those things together, and it sometimes means that these groups are fighting each other, not always, but it can sometimes lead to a fight amongst who gets more representation. There's a case out of Florida that sort of situates this argument amongst fights between, or not fights, but let's just say conflicts between Latinos and African Americans over who gets the last district in the state legislature. And that's never really particularly helpful, certainly when everybody's a part of the same caucus. But more important than that, and again, I want to come back to this point, what's left out of the conversation I just had with you is that the public, voters and constituents and community groups, some of which may represent any number of interests, right? Whether it's age, disability, gender, any of this stuff, that isn't necessarily reflected in the people who sit in the room, right, where it happens, I had to say it. And we need to have more of that. And so to the extent that we have people who are able to talk to groups with some sense of credibility and expertise and then convey those viewpoints to the people in that room or be one of the people in that room, it makes a difference. And I think that's, for me, looking at it in my own experience, that's sort of the work that's still to be done.
So it's getting late and we're almost out of time. I wanted to ask you each to take maybe a minute and say something that you think has been left out of the conversation so far and that maybe, or some closing remark that you want to make.
Sure. Thank you for coming, yes. I guess there actually is a point here from the standpoint of, as obviously Jeff and I are long in the tooth, as they say, but I guess that's a good thing in one sense. It's bad, it's kind of like when you see people on TV, members of Congress or something, or the Senate especially, and they're all, older, and you think, oh, this is bad. But the point is, a lot of these people, and especially in our case, we started very young. So the point is, there is room for people to get involved in the process. And it's becoming nothing but more of a regulated aspect and much more of a scientific aspect of doing all the redistricting and such too. So clearly, you're in the right area of interest for that. And as Kareem said before, I mean, there are a lot of options for you to get involved in the process. You don't have to be destined to be an expert witness in court, but you just may be a good computer person. And ironically, the software that is available, it's either Maptitude or Autobound, or the two made commercial packages, are not all that difficult to run, but it's one of those things that really helps if you are a good computer person, and actually not an IT person, but I mean a data person who can use the computer as a tool. So I think in that sense, I'm heartened to see that there are so many people under 40 that actually have some interest in redistricting.
I'll say that I agree with Clark. When I first planned my talk, I thought I'd be giving kind of a David Letterman's top 100 list of some of the do's and don'ts, but I will add that if you're going to learn to be an expert, work very closely with your lawyer, never give the bad news yourself, let the lawyer do that, and never show a map until the end of a meeting, and never show a map at all if you don't have to, especially if the recipient might not appreciate it. But in terms of this cycle here, and Baker v. Carr, Reynolds versus Sims first came down in the early 60s. I wasn't involved with it then. But when I was just getting out of law school, yet to turn 30, I was watching a case in federal court in New York, and there was a well over 70-year-old retired federal judge representing the Republicans telling a federal panel, in 1950, when I drew the lines, you have to understand how this works. And I thought to myself, I'm not yet 30. I don't want to turn 70 and be where he is yet. I'm getting up there. But it is exciting that those of you who are under whether you're under 30 or under 50, under 60, that there's room for more people here, and that it was not that I wasn't that pleased that after each cycle is over, most of the activists tend to go into some other area. They never want to see redistricting again, but it's an area that if you do it right and honorably, it could develop a good profession for you if you follow some of the rules that we're suggesting tonight. So good luck, and hope to work with you. I'll be here the next 2 days.
I'll keep it brief, and it really reflects, I think, what has been said earlier. But the one thing I would say is just, respect the system that you happen to enter, right? There have been rules, there have been experiences that you will learn from, but don't be cabined by them. I think one of the beauties of coming at this with all this new expertise, and frankly, a new political experience, that is, you're growing up, many of you professionally, some of you actually growing up, in an age that is fundamentally different that none of us could have possibly predicted. I mean, even when I was in law school, I was just even talking about last year, I taught a class on executive power. And, I didn't teach about the emoluments clause. Kudos to anybody who did. My point in saying this is fundamentally a different space, both with respect to politics generally, but with respect to redistricting. And I think some of the beauty in all this is being creative. And so what I hope all of you all think about and stay open to is the way in which your expertise, your experience, your being, your interaction with other groups opens the door to new ways of thinking about some of these issues that we've been plagued by for decades. But I'm hopeful that, at least going forward, we solve at least a few of them going into the next cycle or two.
Yep, expect the unexpected.
Absolutely.
Let's thank the panel for a great discussion.